the Shivers series. This series, made by Sierra, consists of two titles. And it was a remarkable thing, even though it was only two titles. This is in part due to, I guess, it not being as profitable as they hoped, and that the company was in the back end of its time. It was a mix of the point and click puzzle genre that was started by games like Myst and Riven, and horror. So it was a relatively new combination. Well, not necessarily. I mean, this is also how Seventh Guest had started, being a horror game. But um, it balanced everything out. It used a variety of puzzles, some that were well known, some that were not well known, and they sort of varied from easy to downright brutal. I'm looking at the high Q puzzle or IQ puzzle, the solitaire puzzle where you have to end with the peg in the center. Now, these two games, they are only linked by like the littlest of details. And there's a reason for that, I think. Both stories are basically standalone. So it could be that the name Shivers for the franchise would have been more like these are horror stories, so they don't necessarily need to be linked. And that does make some sense. I mean, when you come to horror games or even horror movies, you don't necessarily have the same protagonist in each title. Unless there's some clever way to do it. You may have the same villain, but not in this case. Uh, because since this is more of a puzzle game series, it does contain the element of the supernatural. And it's just fitting that both of the quote antagonists are soul or life essence stealing spirits or demons. Now, of course, there's a little difference on the stories in both of them. In the first game, Shivers, the story is basically you are dared to spend the night in a museum. On the grounds of a haunted museum, you get in and you find out, yeah, it is haunted. There's these life-stealing creatures running about, so you have to catch them all. And the background story of it is literally pretty much you're discovering it as you play. The story is being pieced together as you play the game. And it's purely by chance. So, for this one, the story is more or less a background character for Shivers 1. Shivers 2, however, has the background story as a key component. You are dealing with. You arrive in a town where the people are just downright almost hostile to intruders. And yeah, the town's been broken, has been cut off from the outside recently due to a landslide. So they are going to be a bit untrusting of someone who can get past the landslide. And then everybody disappears, and you are tasked with being the warrior, solving puzzles to get Bajo sticks, prayer sticks, then finding a matching pattern, solving another puzzle to power it up, so it can protect you, and so you can put it in to the kiva. And all along, you have a spirit that comes in to help you, and you're trying to find out who is your antagonist, what their motives are, and then you find even more motives. So the story is more integrated into as the game progresses. And I mean, it's a mix of a corrupt town council, a Native American lore, and a little bit of revenge. So literally, the story is more important to getting through the game than it is in Shivers. Now, of course, with both of these games had a scoring system in it, which I'm a little bit of question on how you figure out a scoring system for these games. In the first game, you got points for listening to recordings, points for reading museum plaque descriptions, points for solving puzzles, but you lose points if you're attacked. And when it comes down to it, one attack is just downright unavoidable. So, I don't necessarily get why the points are in there. I never really figured out the scoring method, how they fully scored in the second one, although it's probably linked to puzzles and items found to solve mysteries and expose the story. So it really does, throw some things out there. So, I don't think, but Sierra always liked to put scoring systems in their games. And I don't know I think they only stopped in the tail end of their production cycle. I mean, if you look at all of Sierra's titles, there is a point system. Some of their games even poke fun at the point system. I mean, literally, the first action in one game, you literally get half the total points in the game. But like I said, and the links I said between the two are very, very loose. At the end of the first game, there was an article about those cyclones. Something about cyclones in the desert. Well, cyclones are not desert occurrences. At least I don't think so. Might have to look up the meaning of cyclone and the difference between a cyclone and a tornado, because there are terms that distinctly mark typhoon. I think typhoon and hurricane are two different, are just basically the same storm, but where it's encountered. But when you play the second game, um, the only links you have to the first game is that in the library there's some books too for written by Professor Windeldot. So it is very unique. I mean, which it sort of leads to me that if this series had continued, they probably would have very loose ties between one and the other. And one could say that I'm not too sure on American Horror Story, but I do know that those are loosely connected. Each season of that. I could be wrong on that. I've never watched American Horror Story. I just read up on certain things. Now, I do recall, I think most of the games initially would receive a teen rating. And even in this day and age, they probably still get a teen rating. And it was, like I said, it's a mix of the puzzles, right? The horror and puzzle games. And each one did have some standouts. I will admit that. I mean, to do when they made Shivers, they literally made like hundreds of watercolor images. Every image in that game is a watercolor, which is remarkable. But for the second game, um, they used panoramic images. And those were pretty much in their infancy at that time, too. And I think this is where it had a plus compared to other games at the time. Maybe it was a little ahead of its time in that sense. Because you look at other point and click games, others that are of the same line, like at the time, Shivers, Riven, Seventh Guest, 11th Hour. You can't necessarily turn around. You have to like click on arrow directions to the left or right to quote turn. And depending on the sophistication level of the game, um, it was either instant with the screen change. You'd see a pan right or a pan left, but you just see the images, they would remain static. Seventh guest, if you 11th hour, if you turn, you do see your character sort of turn the flashlight, but you still had to initiate that. But with Shivers too, you could just take your mouse to the edge of the screen and just turn. You would turn around in a circle, which says a lot for the sophistication of it. And another difference between the two was your inventory system. And Shivers, you only really carried one item at a time. And only if the items could merge, if two items could merge, did you hold both of them at once because it made a whole new item, a complete item. In Shivers 2, you literally had an inventory where you had to manage your inventory. Believe it or not, you could get so far in the game picking up stuff and then you've run out of room because you're carrying everything. And another thing, like I said, and this is where I think the first one was a little bit superior to the second. All the puzzles, while not always all of them were available, you could actually access a lot of puzzles and a lot of things right away and piece them together as you work. With Shivers 2, the story was more dynamic. Puzzles were revealed in time. Some areas would have more than one puzzle hidden in them. Some puzzles were literally unsolvable unless you had them starting in certain positions. And there is one in Shivers 2 that is literally the only way to really pass it is there's no rhyme or reason to solving it because it's a memory puzzle. I gotta give it props though, it was very dynamic. It was never necessarily the same puzzle twice. But it was, you could actually change the course of the game by doing something early. And you could come across a point where you have no clue why something is the correct answer because you haven't found it. You haven't found all the symbolage. You can travel all over. And there is some free exploration, but some puzzles and some events won't become available until certain things are done. I mean, the same was used in Shivers, but not to that extent. And by doing one event early, you actually make it a little bit harder for you to get everything, get all the bajos to the kiva. And this is literally why I think in some ways the first one is far superior than the second one. I mean, I can't knock the second one. There's some pretty good songs in the second one. But that's all I'm gonna. That's basically all I have to say about the Shivers franchise. I mean, it is a shame that Sierra closed its doors and they didn't get a third entry to this franchise. It would have been something to see this franchise in a more 3D environment, as many games we have now. And I would love to see someone try and a fan remake of Shivers in a 3D environment. I mean, trust me, I'd love to go through the museum in the first game. I wished it was an actual place. However, I think the only thing that I will have ever seen closest to a remake of Shivers was an attempt to make it a tablet game. Although I think the same game is available on Facebook. I think. I'm not sure. But you can get both games at GOG. I do recommend playing them, especially the first. If you love horror, a mild horror, definitely go with these games. And yes, the second does have some positives about with more possible endings than the first one. But yeah, definitely look these up. They're not relatively expensive now. If you have an older computer, you definitely want to find a disk copy or find the tools needed to install it on one of the more modern computers. There are some out there too. But if you don't have a CD drive, definitely get off GOG. It's a very fun game, very fun, very interesting game series. And that's all I'm going to say on this series. Thank you for listening, if you still are. Give the video a like, I do appreciate that. And next time round, well, tune in next week, you'll see what goes up then. Bye all.